My name is Jacqueline Sundberg, and I just hit the accept record button. We will be recording today's symposium so that we can share with those who aren't able to attend live. So hello and welcome to today's symposium, Science and Friendship at McGill, a few insights. As I said, I work with ROAAR at the McGill Library, and that stands for the McGill Rare Books and Special Collections, the Owens Library of the History of Medicine, Visual Arts Collection, and Archives and Records Management. And today we bring together a panel of speakers, each exploring ways in which science and friendship, both personal and professional, have inspired extraordinary work and discoveries in collections, I think actually that touch on all of those 4 collections, all of the different categories at ROAAR, and including beyond ROAAR at our partners, the Redpath Museum collections as well. On that note, I'm going to introduce now Ingrid Birker to give one of the presenters today and also a co-organizer of this event. And she's going to be doing a land acknowledgement for all of us. We're delighted that we got to co-organize this together. So over to you, Ingrid.
Thanks, Jacqueline. We are located in Montreal, Canada, and that is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. And they have long been recognized by McGill as the stewards of the lands and the waters where we live, where we work, where we play, where we exchange information. And in a nice segue to our theme, I learned just last week that there was a treaty forged between the Haudenosaunee, it still exists today, and the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. It's called the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, and it was specifically meant as a conservation, a land conservation treaty, but forged in the spirit of peace and friendship and respect, and that's what we're going to be learning about today.
Thanks, Ingrid, for a thoughtful starting to today's discussion. I'm going to pass now the microphone to Nathalie Cooke, the Associate Dean of ROAAR and a Professor of English here at McGill, to give us a few opening comments.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. Thanks, Ingrid, too. Actually, what a lovely start to today's talk. Today's program brings together 4 presentations on very different topics, and topics that are as eclectic as the library and museum collections here at McGill. This topic of science and friendship opens up a new perspective for us to examine our collections. Correspondence takes on new value as a reflection of the relationship of writers. Collecting practices grow out of a friendship of ideas and like-minded collectors. Works of art take shape out of the fruitful collaboration of an artist and a scientist. In the spirit of friendship, it's really a pleasure for ROAAR to host today's symposium, the idea of which originated from Ingrid at the Redpath Museum. In this time of COVID closures, it's a remarkable privilege to be able to share the research and work being done in this library, archival and museum collections here at McGill and elsewhere by hosting virtual events like this one. Thank you all for sharing your time and for being part of our community, remote as though it may be for the time being. On that note, I'd like to thank our sponsors and donors who make the work of putting on events such as this one possible. Our thanks to the Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada for ongoing support, and to private donors Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley. Now I'm going to turn the mic back, with a virtual mic back, to Jacqueline to introduce our first speakers, and I'm really looking forward to enjoying the presentations this afternoon.
Thanks, Nathalie. Just a quick note on what we have on deck. We will have 4 presentations, and after each one, we will have a question and discussion period. It is a little bit tight on time, so we do welcome questions from all of you, and I'll be voicing them on your behalf because we are a fairly large group. So if you have questions for the presenters, please put them in the chat and we will voice them on your behalf. So with that, I will introduce our first presentation. We have from Ingrid Birker and Laura Cameron. And Ingrid, who gave us that lovely opening, I'll give you your full introduction now. She manages the public program at the Redpath Museum, and she's published and edited a variety of booklets, including Tea and Fossils, A Brief History of the Redpath Museum, A Leafy Legacy, a gallery guide, and a fossil's tale, Redpath Museum kids coloring and activity books. She organizes many public events and activities, such as the first Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine Symposium in 2012, and the Cutting Edge Lecture Series in Science, which is ongoing. You can tune in and check the museum's website for those lectures. Her partner in today's presentation is Laura Jean Cameron, a professor of historical geography at Queen's University. Laura Jean is the author of Friend Beloved, which came out in 2021, Openings in 1997. She's co-author with John Forrester of Freud in Cambridge, came out in 2017, as well as the co-editor of Emotion, Place, and Culture and Rethinking the Great White North. So with that introduction, they will be giving a talk entitled Fossils, Friendship, and Scientific Connections, Exploring the Unsettling Lives and Correspondence of Gordon Hewitt and Marie Stopes.
Welcome, everyone. This is the first presentation for our symposium. My name is Ingrid Birker. I'm at the Redpath Museum in Montreal. My co-presenter, Laura Jean, is at Queen's in Kingston, Ontario. We are both on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. These are lands that are part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. It is a covenant of friendship between those nations made to safeguard the conservation and sharing of common hunting grounds. Today, Laura Jean and I are delighted to be addressing some aspects of friendship in the context of scientific activities and networks. In doing so, we'd like to explain the genesis of this symposium on science and friendship, which began when Laura Jean was researching the friendship of two early 20th century scientists through their letters to one another, but also through tracing collections that played an important role in bringing them together.
Thanks, Ingrid, for starting us off so beautifully. Ingrid helped me to navigate the collections of McGill's Redpath Museum, and she generously shared what she knew about the context of one of those fossil collections in the history of geology. Once my book, Friend Beloved, came out, we had a lot of fun, despite COVID restrictions, launching the book at the Redpath with a live theatrical reading.
In working on it together, we found new friendship ourselves. Its surprising and productive quality is captured perhaps by this burl, that's that growth on the side of that tree. It is a tissue growth that is unpredictable, and that's a metaphor for our friendship. At the same time, we also discovered that the theme of science and friendship resonated widely and really deserved a symposium of its own. The ROAAr group was interested in featuring the role of archives and museums in fueling and understanding the role of friendship in science at McGill, and so here we are.
In offering some insights on what the two of us have been learning along the way, we'll start by giving a brief description of the book and how the Redpath Museum connects to the story of the rocky and largely forgotten friendship of Marie Stopes and Gordon Hewitt. And here they are. Marie Carmichael Stopes, the more famous of these two, was a British scientist and a feminist who, after establishing herself as a renowned paleobotanist, would find international fame as a relationship guru and birth control advocate. Marie became friends with this man on the right. This is Charles Gordon Hewitt in 1904 at Manchester University, where she was lecturing. She was the first woman to lecture there in the sciences. Hewitt, first student, then colleague, was rapidly becoming a housefly expert. At age 24, he got a job, a big job, with Canada's settler colonial government as Dominion entomologist, and he became one of Canada's trailblazers of nature conservation. They would each write an acclaimed book. Married Love was Marie's book, a guide to good sex from a woman's perspective that was banned in the US for 20 years, but nonetheless became an international bestseller. The Conservation of the Wildlife of Canada was Hewitt's offering. His book was much less famous, but it also had some international celebrity. A British reviewer said it was one of the first books in the world to impartially and scientifically, quote, take stock of what the world has lost and is losing over one of its largest national areas. Now, the two of them may seem wildly different in terms of topic, but there are some interesting connections and resonances between these books. In both professional and personal life, the two scientists were open to being moved or affected by one another, which some scholars of friendship would argue is a good start to defining what we mean by friendship. Their letters to one another were written between 1907 and 1914 from places in England, Japan, and Canada. They were just a very small part of Stopes's sizable bequest to the British Library. Now, Stopes and Hewitt had a lot in common: love of theatre, ambition, privilege, but also a shared interest in the new science of ecology, from ecos, the Greek, the study of life in its home. Friend Beloved explores, as connective and contrasting threads, their respective versions of ecos in their relationship and in their respective sciences. Their interests came together ecologically in a joint paper that Hewitt referred to as the One Little Sin. Hewitt had resolved never to write a joint paper with anyone, a resolve which he intended to keep, and he did, after this one little co-publication with Stopes. Now, the success of their friendship was a deeply serious matter for Stopes. Indeed, it was one of the important contributions she may have wished to make for science. In her writing, particularly in her writing on behalf of women's suffrage, and in her creative writing of the period, Stopes also wrote novels. Stopes expressed her belief that a friendship of equality between men and women was not only possible, but was an evolutionary imperative. The best chance for this, she thought, was between scientists, specifically English ones. A proponent of self-experimentation, she seems to have wanted her friendship with Hewitt to embody, to prove this scientific fact. And she was tenacious. After ups and downs, transatlantic separation through Hewitt's move to Canada to take up his job, traumatic misunderstanding, it was her important scientific work on fossils that facilitated her own return trips to Canada in 1911 and a return to Hewitt's orbit.
To sum up, a tangle of their relations, the friendship was not, in the end, significantly revitalized as far as we know. Yet, at the same time, thanks in part to the help of the Redpath Museum collections, and this is a photograph showing the gallery, the Dawson Gallery with the fossil collections, Stopes successfully resolved one of Canada's major geological controversies, that is the dating of the geological age of the fern ledges in New Brunswick. Major players in the world of Canadian science here admitted that the controversy involved strata both emotional and geological. Was Dawson, the founder of the Redpath, right or wrong? Upon her return to London, Stopes requested that Dawson's specimens be sent to the British Museum for her further examination. But a month after her return to London, she was still waiting for them and sought assistance from the director of the Geological Survey of Canada in hastening their arrival. Here's what she wrote. Of course I have discovered there is a good deal of wrath in some quarters over the whole subject of the age of the fern ledges, but I did not know there was any feeling in Montreal, and I hope there is not. It may be merely slackness or official delay on their part, and if so, a note from you might get things moving. Until I get them, it is difficult to work entirely satisfactorily, as much depends on what some of Sir William's plants really are. Mary Stopes found that Dawson's dating was incorrect. Here is that specimen, Calamites. There's a photo of it, and I'm going to hold it up so we can take a closer look at it. It's heavy. It's about the weight of a roof shingle. There's a close-up of the label. Now I'm bringing it back. It's going to fill the frame. It does show the fossil called Calamites. That's a very primitive ancestral form of what today are the scouring rushes that we find just on roadsides. And they're small. They're never the size they were in the Carboniferous. She wrote the correction, or she didn't write it. No, she supplied it. That little correction, you see, not Devonian. Those words were supplied by her.
Yeah, so great to see you hold the fossil. But it's time we have to wrap this up, moving to some concluding thoughts. The friendship of Hewitt and Stopes began like our own, with an inquiry into fossils. This talk gives just a glimpse of the sort of conversations we've had over the course of this project, which centers careers, friendship, and emotional trajectories at a key moment in the women's suffrage movement and the making of modern science. So a few points. First of all, was friendship, a friendship of equality and collaboration between men and women scientists, a reality in the early 20th century? For Mari Stopes, was it scientific fact or creative fiction? Well, it remained mostly in fiction for Stopes, and her ideal was only realized briefly in Hewitt, who a few years later would die at the age of 35 in the Spanish flu pandemic following World War I. Throughout the friendship, the two wrestled with very different understandings of the ecos. And for Hewitt, the ecos he came to engage with most closely in Canada was very much a man's world only.
Plus, does personal experience affect intellectual achievement? Admittedly, this is one case only, and we'll be hearing about several others following this talk. But tracing Hewitt and Stopes' relationship shows science to be made through what Felix Driver refers to as all too human relationships, rather than the product of disembodied authorship.
And of course, this friendship of scientists takes place in the context of colonialism, imperialism, male dominance, and white supremacy. And this framework also affects the stories of scientific discovery. In their network of relations, Hewitt is also friends with Duncan Campbell Scott, the now notorious Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, determined to eliminate what he called, quote, the Indian problem. Stopes is also friends with Helen McMurtry, Canada's most notorious promoter of eugenics. As Hua Su writes, some friends seem to complete us, others complicate us.
We'd like to emphasize here the importance of objects such as the fossils I showed you in friendship. The long-distance relationship of Hewitt and Stopes was initiated, fueled, and sustained, not by letters alone, but by material objects, and in this case, fossils. Relatedly, archives and museums are thus not just sites of objects and texts, but sites where one may explore rich and complex histories of friendship and relationships over time and networked with different places.
So the friendship of Hewitt and Stopes began like our own, with an inquiry into fossils. This talk has given a glimpse at some of the things Ingrid and I have been talking about and exploring together the last few years. Archives and museums have emerged for us as lively sites for creating friendship, but also for cultivating critical conversations about sometimes rocky and difficult relationships. And by engaging with the ever-branching networks of scientific friendships, we suggest that such conversations may cultivate a context of healing and redress for historical and ongoing issues of inequity and injustice. They may even inspire what philosopher Akil Membe suggests may be new roles for archives and museums in a broader project of healing the earth and recomposing the common. Anyhow, we end on a hopeful note. Thanks so much for your attention.
We're seeing Zoom applause on mute from the crowd. So thank you so much, Ingrid and Laura, for that presentation. If you do have questions for them, they are here live. Yes, some portions of this are pre-recorded and some are live. So we welcome your questions live. We have one that came in and we'll kick it off with that actually, from Vicky in the audience, asking whether their research was based only in the scientific community and what about non-scientific population? Was any of that collaborative work between Stopes and Hewitt from the non-scientific community, or was it something that grew out of their shared scientific interest?
Laura, you're better positioned.
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you so much for it. They're oh gosh, they certainly were very much of the scientific community. Their first connection was forged in a afternoon conversation group, maybe something like this, called Pleasant Friday Afternoons, where they met. And it was an ecological context where lots of different topics could come up. It's interesting to think about that particular conversation group because, you know, there were connections, of course. A lot of natural scientists were in that group who had connections with amateurs who had collections. So there's a lot of intermingling. I just want to say that a lot of their work, like early connections, was in this context of sort of an early interest in ecology, early interest in different forms of natural history, and some connections with community as well. And maybe just to say briefly, the little paper that they wrote together emerged from Stopes's visit to Japan, to a place, area, Shiobara. And there are fossils that she was collecting there of insects, which she sent to Hewitt. But then she also went on holiday, actually. She was on holiday and she found a really interesting colony of ants, which she found fascinating because they were in little tent structures. And she had real interaction with the community, I suppose, local community, when she tried to obtain this nest, because she wanted to preserve it somehow and send it back to England so some people could see what it was. And she ended up actually stealing a sake bottle and emptying so she could preserve, using the sake to preserve the ants and ship it in that bottle. Anyhow, yes, interactions with community, perhaps not ethical in all ways, just to highlight a couple of those. Anyway, sorry, what about you, Ingrid? Sorry, I just wanted to, I was interested in that question.
I always understood, one of the first weeks that I arrived at the Redpath Museum, the curator of zoology pulled down her book by Mari Stopes called Unmarried Love. And she said, and you'll find when you go through the collections and learn about our fossils, there's a whole bunch of plant fossils that this woman, she was a paleobotanist before she became famous for being a suffragette. And then that was like in 1981, the summer of 1981. So I tried to learn, of course, I looked at the collections, tried to learn about them, but it wasn't until Laura showed up in 2018 that I actually had to really come to an understanding of what it meant to be a scientist, a woman who cared about society, who cared about justice, who cared about equal rights. And so I guess there's such an overlap. It's not just science. There's always an overlap, and we can't segregate our lives that easily. It's not tidy.
It's interesting that you started your talk with highlighting, in some ways, the ways in which these two individuals were so very disparate, because they are. And learning a little bit more about Marie Stopes, is she's such a remarkable woman, and that book Unmarried Love and her work as a feminist. At first glance, you said very clearly, Laura Jean, that they're very disparate individuals, and a man and a woman at that time as well, two scientists, and you highlight the possibility or the question of these friendships, a man and a woman, the possibility of those personal and professional friendships. And it's interesting that you started with the differences and wound up with what united them. Maybe you can expand a little bit more on how two such very different people both wound up at such a pleasant Friday afternoon conversation. It's a very nice title for a series. We might, borrow something like that at the library. But how did it still is just remarkable to me that two such very different and disparate people came together.
Well, in some ways, I would almost say, no, they actually had a lot of commonality, and that's what brought them together, even though, right, they may be even intrigued that they disagreed with some things, but they were both very ambitious, and she was known as the youngest, doctor of science in the UK at that time, and being a woman. He became the next one. They're very competitive, which drew them together. And he had been a student of hers as well. And then they were in a little network of friendships. Her partner at the time when she intended to marry was a Japanese man named Kenjiro Fuji. And that's what took her, well, and she also took, her research took her to Japan as well, but there was also connections there through relationships like that. And she was very good friends with Hewitt's partner, who was betrothed to. There's a lot of complications here because they each end up marrying different people in the end. They both marry Canadians, actually, in 1911. But it's not necessarily, their friendship, I find, is fascinating because they were trying to maintain it through discussing other relationships as well. Like they both were interested in analyzing each other's relations with the people as well as the relationship with non-humans. And that was a big bulk of their conversation too, the scientific work. I think she very much thought that the reason why it was so important to try and have a friend with a man is that that really was key to justice in the scientific world. And she was really, that was a key thing for her too.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the practice of building your friendships by discussing their friendships is very common. I mean, that's what we all do in some ways on social media and other things. It's a unifier. You discuss your networks. And it's interesting, though, that you mentioned that the material objects, they were connected very much by the fossil collections that they came together over. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about your archival research, like your process. This will be the last question, but your archival research and what kind of collections you had to wade into to pull this, to kind of tease out the threads of this complicated friendship.
Oh gosh, thanks for that question. Well, one of the collections and my attempt to find it led me to Ingrid. Of course, so we were trying to highlight in this talk the connections with the Red Path. And that was a really great moment to get there and hold, right here in right near where I'm in Kingston, just heading over to Montreal. But however, the places I had to go included the British Library, the Natural History Museum. I was over in Portland Bill in the UK. I was searching all over the place in people's attics out in different cities in the UK, but also headed out to the East Coast here in Canada, where that's where Hewitt ended up. He married into the Borden family, a very important political family. Who he married in 1911 was Elizabeth Borden. And the Borden house is still there, and people who know the Bordens and certainly meeting up with Hewitt's great niece, who had boxes of materials on Hewitt. So that there was that, but I think what we wanted to highlight in terms of thinking about the objects, holding the letters, holding the fossils, was a way to connect with the characters, Hewitt and Stopes. A lot of the things I was finding they were holding too in their hand, and they were the very things that were holding them together, like the Shirobara fossils from Japan are the last thing Hewitt is holding as he writes his last letter to her. And it's like in the fossils that are reminding him of her. And so it's just that kind of resonance, how friendship is made of people, yes, but they're also, made of relations between all sorts of more than human people, including the fossils.
Well, thank you so much, Laura and Ingrid, for such an interesting look into a collection beyond our four walls and that bridged seas and disciplines and brought two such interesting people together. Well, actually, I should say four, because the two of you and your subjects. On that note, I'm going to transition. We'll move now to our second presentation. So let me introduce, thank you to both. I will just once again share my screen. And let me introduce our second speaker, who is Christopher Lyons. He's the head librarian of Rare Books and Special Collections here at McGill. He is an eager and enthusiastic collector in his own right. He's also a historian, and he was also, in fact, the head of the Owens Library for a number of years before he stepped into his current role as head of Rare Books. And he brings a deep knowledge of the Owens collection to share with us today. His curatorial areas now include Canadian literature, sports, including the Olympics and 20th century history collection. His presentation today is called Birds of a Feather, Lomer Wood and the Creation of an Extraordinary Natural History Collection.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Lyons, and I'm delighted to be with you here today to give you perhaps a bit of an unorthodox spin on the theme of our discussions today. So my topic is an interesting one because it's looking at a collaboration not between scientists but perhaps unusually between a scientist / medical researcher and a librarian who together develop one of the most significant natural history collections in North America. So I'm very excited to share this story with you because I think it shows how different kinds of collaborations can lead to very interesting scientific developments. So the two people we're going to be looking at, Gerhard Lomer and Casey Wood, are both responsible for what today we know as the Blacker Wood Natural History Collection here at Rare Books and Special Collections. But to understand its genesis, we have to go a bit back in time. So McGill, as you know, has celebrated its bicentennial recently, and for much of its, say, first 100 years, it's probably more accurately described as a professional school with a medical school and a faculty of law with affiliated theological colleges, and perhaps a gentleman's finishing school, for want of a better word, for people in the arts and sciences. That shifted fairly dramatically in the late 19th and early 20th century. And a lot of it was due to this man, the principal of the time, Sir William Peterson, who very much emphasized the development of the European model, I want to say, of research, of having strong research intensive post-secondary institutions, in this case, McGill and its focus on arts and sciences, but particularly the sciences, at least that's what better known for perhaps. And I'm thinking of Sir Ernest Rutherford, who was the researcher here at McGill who went on to win the Nobel Prize in physics. And that was just indicative of what was happening on campus, and a very strong emphasis on doing graduate research in a number of areas. And in fact, the graduate studies department was founded at this time too, in the early 20th century. So we have this principal who's driving this new agenda for McGill, but the infrastructure to support it is somewhat lacking. There are new buildings, thankfully, William MacDonald in particular responsible for a number of buildings in the sciences, and Lord Strathcona for a new medical building after the other one burnt down. In the early 20th century. There was a library that was built thanks to the Redpath family in 1893, but despite the fact that it has this beautiful reading room and very well developed and everything, by the early 20th century was already inadequate. It was capacity had been reached, even though there was an extension put on in the early 20th century to increase its stack space. And the university was growing, demand for literature was growing, and the library was having a very difficult time keeping up, in part because it just didn't have the resources, either the space or the human resources or the collection to support this new research. Now, if you think of it, the 20th century, late 19th, 20th century, really the written word is a critical element to doing scientific research. Think of the scientific and medical journals, for one thing, as being incredibly important for new discoveries, new ideas, and also in the arts as well. And also, in addition to that, monographic literature. So Gerhard Lomer steps in and realizes he's got a big problem because he can't keep up. And so he is desperately trying to find resources to develop it. There's a Centennial Capital Campaign. Sound familiar, anyone? And the whole push in that is to try and raise money for the biggest needs in the university. One of them was to get a new building for the library. Sadly, it didn't work. Gerhard Lomer had actually even penned a pamphlet for part of the campaign describing the library and its resources as laboratory for the whole university. Sadly, he didn't get what he wanted, but in the context of all of this, he did meet a strong ally, this man, Casey Albert Wood, who was a Canadian who studied medicine, not at McGill, but at Bishop's, because Bishop's University, which still exists, had a separate medical school. Subsequently, they merged. So he became a ex post facto graduate of McGill's medical school, but went on to become a successful physician, made a lot of money, specialized in ophthalmology. So in addition to having a lucrative practice in Chicago, was also doing research and grew interested in the vision of birds in particular. He'd always had a love of animals, but he also now developed a professional interest in them and came to McGill, I'd like to say, through the influence of Sir William Osler. Sir William Osler was another Canadian McGill medical graduate, professor, subsequently Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford, was knighted in 1911, was rock star of the Anglo-American medical world in a number of reasons. But part of his ethos was to build libraries and build collections so that people can learn more about medicine. So he developed a wonderful collection, which he thought was representative of the history of medicine, development of medicine. And as early as 1911 was telling McGill, yes, we'll donate this to you. When he dies in 1919, the collection is on its way to McGill. It takes 10 years before it's actually settled here. But I think this becomes a very important influence for Casey Wood, who in 1920, notice 1919, Osler dies, 1920, Casey Wood founds not one, but two libraries. He founds the Emma Shearer Wood Library of Ornithology, named after his wife, wonderful collection of material. And then, in the chutzpah, I love this, it's such chutzpah, gets his neighbors in Pasadena, California, where he's retired, to donate the money to establish and endow a zoological library as well. So kudos to this man. That's a very impressive act. He didn't only put his own money and some of his own collection where his mouth was, he used his mouth to sweet talk his neighbors, if no one else, into giving money. There was a third attempt, this is all in 1920, to go one step further, and that was to find the resources to create its own library for those two aforementioned collections, plus other special collections. So have this. Gerhard Lomer had Percy, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank here, Percy Nobbs, to develop the drawings for a new building, and he shopped them around to try and get a donor. Sadly, was unsuccessful, but through the capital campaign, there was money to extend the Redpath Library southwards to create more space, where on the different floors, these new libraries were founded, plus the genesis of the Rare Books Library and Blackadder Lauderman Library of Art and Architecture. So the dream in a truncated form is coming to fruition in terms of having great library resources and collections. The collections are the part that I find particularly fascinating, and I can only touch upon them here. And that is that it's Catholic in the most Catholic sense of the word, in that it's not only deep in terms of collecting contemporary, modern, up-to-date historical, not historical literature, but scientific literature, periodical, monographic, but also other elements, including more popular books, because Wood's love of animals extended to having a popular collection. As you can see here, books for children on birds. It also would go on these tours of Europe. Lomer and Wood themselves went on a couple of these tours, and Wood would travel to Europe frequently to go to all the antiquarian bookshops in the continent and in Britain to collect this as much wonderful material as they could find. So, for example, this collection of early 19th century Indian paintings of birds and flora and fauna done by two sisters who were there because Elizabeth Gwillim's husband was named to the judiciary in Madras in southern India. this wonderful collection of illustrations of birds done with the real birds, and not only the feathers, but beaks in that. That's called the Feather Book 1618. It's a wonderful, unique item. Casey Woods even went to Asia. He went on what I like to jokingly call book safaris or biblio safaris to places like Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to collect material, not only books, but related material. These are olas, which are like books, but then he would also collect other artifacts and not only donate them to the library, but also to the medical museum that exists at the time, the Redpath Museum as well. So there's a beautiful example of a letter from Candy in Sri Lanka. I just love the hotel stationery. So he also wrote, like Osler, a bibliography of his collection. And I have to say, this has become one of those standard works of the collection of what the literature in zoology and ornithology should be based on the collection. So Casey Woods dies in 1942, but his legacy lives on. We still collect historical works in natural history. We have one of the best collections in North America, I'm pleased to say, curated by my colleague Lauren Williams, and in part funded by a generous bequest by Eleanor McLean, whom some of you might have known, who was a longtime curator of this collection. So we have this wonderful collection. It's still available and it's still here for consultation, not only by researchers, for just people who are curious. So we like to keep the open door policy that our predecessors and founders of that collection, Gerhard Lomer and Casey Wood, enshrined when they founded the collection just over 100 years ago. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Now I will kick off a question for you from me. I definitely can relate to what you mentioned, the problem of the library not being able to keep up with the demands of research and space to accommodate all of the materials that supports the research and work at McGill. I also can relate to the new building campaign.
The parallels are striking. Yes.
Yes. And but my question is actually more to you as a collector and an inheritor of the legacy of these two friends who built this collection together. You mentioned a biblio safari or a book safari that they would go on, a tour of continental Europe. And it's something that is, I'm sure, immensely attractive in these days of COVID lockdown, that we all dream of armchair travel and touring all of the lovely rare books dealers on the continent. What does collecting for the collection look like today? And perhaps that question is better addressed to Lauren Williams, the current curator, but maybe you can shed a little light on what the process of building this collection looks like today.
Okay, so I think it's true across the board, in that in some respects it's very different, in some respects it's very similar. And when we talk about building collections, I want to say we're talking specifically about physical collections, because you could also talk about building collections of digital material and stuff like that. So let's leave that aside. And there is the means that have existed for couple of 100 years or so, which is through contacts with antiquarian book dealers, say through catalogs or through auctions, knowing what's available. Of course, also being able to do that online, that's the other thing. But there is also still a big part of building collections which requires going out and speaking to people, knowing people and seeing things. So the biblio safaris, as I said, that's one thing, definitely. And as you cast a net, as you talk to people, they realize, okay, this is what you're collecting. And of course, for the trade, that's good, because then people start to look out for things for you. So it's a process that builds on itself. It builds over time. It builds as you understand things more, and it also builds as you talk to more people and see more things, and they discover things, and then you bring them in and you talk to researchers as well and get to know, and other people get to know them. That's part of it. There are also the donation. So Wood is a donor par excellence, and we have current people who've been very generous and donated collections, large and small, to us. And if any of our viewers are thinking about helping us build collections, that's great. And that's part of it too. So,
And that's the legacy of these two men together, is
Very
the
much.
gift of the one inspired the gift of the other.
yeah,
And now today, those collections also live digitally and are digitally available. And Nathalie actually has put a question in the chat,
Oh,
which I will
yes.
voice for you. But it's can you speak a bit about where the public can find and see digital surrogates of some of our material in open access venues today?
Yes, okay, that's a good question, and there's several sites. And McGill's if you go to the library website, there's a digital collections link to it, and so that's one way of going to explore. And there's a lot of different things. So we talk about some of the natural history collection, which has been digitized, but then there's also a lot of other material. So it's a lot of fun just to do some virtual touring or exhibiting or taking it in that way. McGill has also been very good at uploading material to both Hattie Trust, which is I think US based conglomerate, and the Internet Archive, which is another one where they're great. They're wonderful sites to see, again, all kinds of things from all over the world that different institutions and individuals have digitized and made available. So it's a rich universe. And of course, if you just Google things, you'll find a lot of this as well. So there's always
That's
that
true.
too.
We can provide links, though. We will send out an email tomorrow with some follow-up links and ways that you can
Yeah.
explore these collections today.
Mhm.
One of maybe a last question for you, and then we'll move on to our next presentation. One of the slides that you showed was, in fact, the feather book, and I think that is one of the ones that is available, that people could go in and look at one of the digital collections and exhibitions. They could look at that one themselves. Is that right?
Yeah, there's some of it. I'm not sure if it's the whole thing has been digitized. So there have been individual ones that have been, but I'd have to double check to see if they all are, because there's over 100 of them. It's a quite spectacular thing. They're encased now, so they were literally bound. So you can imagine how big the book would have been, because the individual leaves were like this big, and they're three-dimensional because it's the feathers, and as I mentioned, there are bits of beaks and some of the claws were actually, so they're cartilage. So they were disbound at some point. I want to say maybe when they were acquired, and there we go. So the entire feather book has been digitized. Thank you, Lauren, for weighing in.
There's a link in the chat there if
Yeah,
you want to
yeah.
explore. It
Yeah,
is a
so
fascinating object, and it's one of the ones that would not have wound up at McGill had Wood likely not gone on a biblio safari at some
yeah,
point. in
that
the-
one,
or-
I know there's been some work to try and figure out where it was purchased, but I think Lomer actually was the one who either found it or it was quoted. I think it was quoted to him by a dealer in Britain. Lauren, you can correct me if I'm wrong on those details. But again, that's because of this iterative process of Lomer didn't buy it, of getting out and people know what you're looking for. They'll find something cool and they'll tell you that. So Nathalie Cooke is my boss. If we need to go on any biblio safaris.
Oh, you're dropping hints now. Well, on that note, I'll say thank you, Chris, and I'll cut
You're
you
welcome.
off and I'll introduce our next presenter. But hint well taken, I would love to go on a biblio safari as well. So let me introduce our next presenter, Eric Andrew. Now, I apologize, Eric, you have to correct me. I didn't double check on how to pronounce your last name. So before Guy, there you go. Thank you, Eric Andrew Guy. Looking at my notes here, Eric is the Globe and Mail's Quebec correspondent and is now based in Montreal. He studied history right here at McGill, and I think he also cut his teeth at one of the McGill student newspapers. He's also worked as a reporter at the Globe for 6 years, and his work focuses on the intersection of the Canadian past with current events. The presentation we're going to hear today is Two Heads on the Same Body, how Wilder Penfield and William Cone discovered the human brain and lost each other. So a different tone and topic from our last two presentations.
Wilder Penfield and William Cone revolutionized neurosurgery together. co-founded probably the world's greatest center for brain research together, led a team together that made groundbreaking discoveries about memory, pleasure, anxiety, and learning. They worked together in double harness, as they both like to say, for 35 years. But they were also an unlikely pair, a study in contrasts. It's something that Penfield noticed at their very first meeting, when Cooke came to work as his assistant at the New York Presbyterian Hospital in 1924. Penfield was doing most of the neurosurgery at the Presbyterian then. He was, in every way, an up-and-coming star physician, tall, handsome, a former Princeton football standout, and a Rhodes Scholar, brimming with charm and self-confidence. The man he saw coming up the stairs to greet him was his opposite in many ways, a stout, stocky, toothy man with short legs and a shy smile, fresh out of medical school in Podunk, Iowa. William Cooke looked every inch the sidekick, and Penfield quickly found out he was a really good one. The man simply loved to work, both at the bedsides of the epileptics, cases of water on the brain, and New York City car crash victims that came their way, but also in the laboratory, studying the brains of the patients they lost. They lost a lot of patients in those days. Neurosurgery was in its infancy. They were essentially making it up as they went along. In a letter to his mother, a despondent Penfield called it a terrible profession. No wonder he thought Cooke was such a godsend. When Penfield was recruited by McGill and the Royal Victoria Hospital in 1928, he made Cooke coming along a condition of his acceptance. They were not only colleagues, but close friends now. Cooke was Uncle Bill to Penfield's children, and he passed up a better competing offer from the Presbyterian to join his mentor in Montreal. The double harness was tightening. By this point, Cooke was a gifted surgeon in his own right. He actually enjoyed surgery. He called long procedures symphonies because it was hands-on and directly helped patients. He was a doctor first and a scientist second. He hated writing up his findings. He couldn't sit still long enough. Penfield, by contrast, liked to discover new things. He had a dream of locating the seat of human consciousness in the brain, of discovering the soul. In the operating room at the RVH then, it sometimes fell to Cooke to urge caution as Penfield pushed the boundaries of established surgical practice. In those early days in Montreal, Penfield almost killed an epileptic teenager and even his own sister, who was suffering from a brain tumor, while Cooke stood at his shoulder, trying to rein him in. That visionary streak, however, also made Penfield a kind of genius, and in the 1930s he produced his two masterpieces. The first was the so-called Montreal procedure, a technique for epilepsy surgery that involved opening the skull of a waking patient and electrocuting different parts of their brain until it stimulated a seizure, then removing that part of the brain. It was miraculously effective, even if it sometimes produced side effects like memory loss. And it contained an even more important scientific lesson. Stimulating certain sections of the brain could produce spontaneous behaviors and experiences, like the sound of specific songs or hallucinated scenes playing out before a patient's eyes. This helped Penfield map the brain. This is where memory is stored. This is where music is experienced. It turned out to be an overly crude localization of function, but it was an important insight. His second masterstroke was founding the Montreal Neurological Institute, in 1934. His big idea was to combine a working neurosurgical hospital with a massive lab apparatus for studying the brain. It sounds intuitive now, but brain surgery was still seen as somewhat disreputable by some neurologists, and there was nothing quite like the neuro anywhere in the world at the time. Staff at the Institute referred to Penfield as the chief and Cooke as the boss, a reflection of his role in running the place day to day. He was the engine room, as one former neuro resident called him. Cooke, by this point, was the more talented pure surgeon and the more dedicated physician. It was him who really healed the patients. Although in an old contract between the two of them that I found, it emerged that Penfield made twice as much money. When the Second World War broke out, staff at the Neuro were enlisted to create the Canadian neurological hospital in England, and Cone was chosen as its chief surgeon. He served heroically overseas and amazed just about everyone he met with his energy and skill. The friends missed each other. They wrote pining letters to each other signed love. But Cone's great success made Penfield jealous, and he was trying desperately to replace Cone overseas. He was thwarted again and again by a blur on his chest x-ray. Cone returned from the war more confident and less willing to play helpmeet. Penfield, meanwhile, was growing ever more focused on the study of epilepsy and a series of new collaborators who shared his single-minded passion. Their differences, which had once been so complementary, were now pulling them apart. By the 1950s, there were two camps at the Neuro. Cone's people focused on spinal surgeries and patient care. Penfield's focused on epilepsy. They each jealously guarded their residents and resented those who tried to straddle the divide. The split erupted in 1953 when Penfield passed Cone over for the directorship of the Institute. Everyone expected that he would get the top job when the chief retired. Cone was devastated by the slight and by the thought of working without Penfield equally, and he threatened to quit until Penfield agreed to stay on part-time. The complicated brew of their relationship, master and apprentice, rivals, best friends, spilled over in a bitter fight in Penfield's office, where Cone said he should stay in their double harness and die there. It was a darkly foreboding comment. After the fight, Cone fell into a deep depression. He continued to work manically, but increasingly preferred to work at night, away from the gaze of others. In the early morning of May 4th, 1959, he closed the door of his office, lay his head on a pillow on the floor, and ingested a fatal dose of cyanide. Penfield was heartbroken by the loss of his friend and tortured by his role in it. He kept a diary dedicated to thoughts and memories of Cone and his death. More than a decade later, he still kept no fewer than 4 photos of Cone in his office. The tension between their roles made them a great scientific partnership. Penfield often acknowledged that he could never have founded or run the Neuro without Cone's tireless work and technical skill. Cone wouldn't have thrived without the leadership and mentorship that Penfield provided. Together, they healed thousands of patients, trained hundreds of surgeons who spread their high standards around the globe, and advanced our understanding of the human brain and therefore of human nature. But that same tension between their roles was also a time bomb at the heart of their partnership, and eventually it went off. A year after Cone's death, by coincidence, C.S. Lewis wrote in his book, The Four Loves, about philia, the bond between friends. The ancients considered it the highest, purest form of love, he wrote. Although it was underappreciated in the modern world, it had also helped give birth to modernity, because friends, sitting around and talking, had given us many of the great intellectual leaps forward, from mathematics to romanticism. Cone and Penfield had a deeply loving friendship, and together, standing and talking over a microscope or the head of a patient, they helped give birth to the romantic mathematics of neuroscience.
Well, thanks, Eric. I'll give my round of applause. It's such an interesting story, a remarkable story of this friendship, such a fraught and fruitful collaboration. And I know for my part, I've been in and around McGill for the last decade, and I confess this was the first time I had heard of Cone. And I wonder if you could comment, like, how did you come across this story? How did it catch your interest, this friendship?
Yeah, so I was hired as the Globe's Quebec correspondent April 2020, which was a bad time to start a new job in a new city. So I put it off. I've only just moved in September, but for the last year and a half, I've known that this is what I was going to be doing. So I started just kind of reading into Montreal history. I knew about the Neuro, of course. I kept coming across it over the years and research about other topics. I'd be writing about the effect of smartphones on the brain, and I would come across some study from the Neuro in the 50s. And I thought these were all sort of American books, and it's actually sort of underrated how important it is in Canada. And so I thought I wanted to write something about it. And there's a couple of good institutional histories that are sort of either written or co-written by William Findell, who was its director for a long time and a big medical historian in his own right. And there was Cone. And like I saw someone mentioning in the comments, there's a street named after Penfield. There's a heritage moment that I saw on TV as a kid. He's famous. He's still, you know, he was considered the greatest Canadian in his lifetime. There was a poll or something. I mean, he was, and I'd never heard of Cone. So that was the initial impulse. What's going on here? How is it the co-founder of this place?
Yeah.
And someone who, the more you read about it, the more you realize was really integral to its golden age, was so unknown. And then, of course, finding out about his tragic suicide made me even more curious. And the more I learned, the more intrigued I became. His closeness with Penfield, and I want to say before I forget that Mary Hay-Gurl, who's here on the call, was instrumental in my research and helped me sift through the Osler collection from afar by email, because I was in Toronto and everything was locked down. But she sent me these great caches of letters between the two, and that was apart from interviews and the usual journalistic stuff, that was the meat of my research. And I've just published a piece in the Globe about Cone, so that was kind of what I ended up doing with this interest in Cone. Just
you and Laura have that in common, in that your research was looking largely at correspondence. And Laura, feel free to unmute and ask a question yourself.
Oh, just such an interesting talk. Thank you so much. I was really struck by your mention of a romantic friendship, because that's what I was discovering and wrestling with in my research as well. Mari Stopes' model for friendship was that, and she learned it as a child, and it was, you know, same-sex relationships with other girls. Like there was a sense of romance and a bit of ceremony even with a friendship. It was an ideal, like a friendship was a very important thing. And she carried that over into her, you know, her adult relationships with both men and women, which led to complications, it seems, although some others shared her understanding or acceptance of this idea of romantic friendship. It was part of the culture of her period. I'm wondering about your period and your two men who have this romantic friendship. Was it something that was accepted? Was it questioned? Or, you know, when you're here reading about other people talking about their closeness, was that something that was appreciated in terms of that filial love you're talking about?
You know, they were clearly very, very fond of each other. They loved each other, and you can see it in the photos even. They did have this sort of master and apprentice relationship, and Cone idolized and looked up to Penfield, and that you can see in the photos too. And about half of the photos, Cone is sort of looking adoringly at Penfield. It's quite sweet, actually. And you know, they would sign their letters, love, wide, love, Bill. You know, Penfield helped organize sending over Christmas presents to Cone when he was overseas for the war and stuff. You know, I haven't seen much about what people made of this. I don't think it was considered especially noteworthy necessarily. They were number one and number two running this hospital, and that was the core of their relationship, was this professional partnership, which was a perfect partnership in many ways until it wasn't. I mean, they complemented each other perfectly. Penfield was a visionary and Cone was kind of a worker bee, and they really needed each other to accomplish what they wanted to. But I was really moved, especially given how the friendship ended up, to see in their letters how tender and fond they were towards each other. I mean, Penfield would be away on a work trip, and Cone would be house sitting for him, and he'd say, "We're having a great time, but except that I miss you." Just the simple things like that, you know. I don't want to overstate it. It's not gushy. It's just they were really, really fond of each other, and it still pains me. I get sort of emotional thinking about it. That this, I think Cone's sort of heartbreak at being what he felt he was betrayed by Penfield, because Penfield was retiring and realized, probably rightly, that Cone would not have made a great director because he was not interested in paperwork and administration, in promotion, and so he made a hiring committee to find someone else. They didn't pick Cone, and they probably shouldn't have. But for 25 years, Cone had assumed that his turn would be next, and they had drifted at this point, and so there wasn't good communication between the two of them. Anyway, it's
we have one more question. Chris
you.
has his hand up, so that will be the last one. Thanks, Laura, for that comparison. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks. You pretty much answered it, because the mystery was, at least for me, is why was Cone passed over? And you're right. He wasn't the charismatic person that Penfield was at all. But how did they handle that immediately? Like you described the fight and stuff. Like, was there any discussion? It just seemed sort of strange. Like it was dropped on his head. You're not getting the job. Like, there was nothing around it. I've never read any of the correspondence or anything. Do you know if they ever tried to discuss it?
There's quite a bit about this, and I mentioned my sources more in the article than I did in my talk. But Penfield's grandson, Jefferson Lewis, wrote a biography of him that discusses this at some length. So that Cone was blindsided by both the fact that Penfield was retiring, which was very upsetting to him, that he hadn't been told. I mean, it's sort of hard to imagine, actually. They were number 1 and 2 and best friends, and so that there was a hiring committee that had been struck to find his replacement, rather than just, here, Bill, here's the scepter, which is kind of what I think he expected. So Penfield, I think everyone now agrees, who I've spoken to, didn't handle it well. He had a lot of things on the go. He was and sometimes I think neglected the emotional side of his relationship with Cone at that stage in their relationship, anyway. And Cone did not take it lightly. I discussed this a bit more in the article too, but he went to the principal of McGill to try to block Penfield's retirement. He went to Penfield's wife to try to talk him out of it.
Clearly, we've got a whole larger story to explore, and not enough time, I'm afraid, to go into the details. So we will send out a link to your article. And for the curious, Mary commented in the chat, but the correspondence is there if you want to explore that relationship for yourself. And I want to thank you, Eric and Chris, for an interesting discussion and an invitation for further exploration. Sorry to cut you off, but we have one more presentation. No. So let me introduce our final presentation, our final speaker. This is Gwendolyn Owens. She's the head and director of the Visual Arts Collection here at McGill. Her scholarly publications include articles, catalogs, exhibition catalogs, books on artist and architect Gordon Matta Clark, painters Maurice Prendergast, Lauren Harris, and David Milne, Montreal artist and architect Melvin Charney, 20th century art markets, and kitchen wallpaper, perhaps the one that piques my interest the most. She's currently researching the art of Marian Dale Scott, and her presentation today will share some of that research. So let me once again share my screen.
If you open the door to room 153 in the Strathcona Anatomy Building at McGill, you find an amazing surprise. On the south wall is an enormous work of art, 16 feet long by 12 feet high. In it, a central figure, a man shown from the back, striding, leaning forward. Swirling around him are other figures, even a baby, and a strange circular series of objects, and what looks like blobs. Look at the overall design and you see large shapes, a spiral, hexagons, and rectangles. Everything seems to be floating on a flat plane. What's going on here? This is Endocrinology, a mural by Marian Scott, picturing the groundbreaking research at McGill by Professor Hans Selye. In the nearly 80 years since the creation of this work of art, in 1943, it has fascinated, baffled, delighted, and sometimes even annoyed people who come into this room. In the first issue of a new publication called Canadian Art, Hans Selye and artist Marian Scott both wrote about this work of art to introduce it to the public. Selye's text was titled Art as an Inspiration to Science, and Dale Scott's text was titled Science as an Inspiration to Art. The message was that this was a work of collaboration. Indeed, Selye would write that the whole department of histology, a term that means the study of microscopic structures of tissues, was part of the collaboration. So that readers would not be confused, the publication also included an explanatory text describing what was in the composition. Those blobs were hormones, glands, and the swirl of human figures were people whose bodies had conditions affected by changes in the functioning or malfunctioning of this internal control system of the body. Selye would note that, to the endocrinologist, these details are self-explanatory. The central figure was described as the seeker, a stand-in for the scientist. In his text, Professor Selye continued, "It occurred to me that in the medical building, a mural symbolizing our scientific activities would be particularly appropriate. The carefully planned compositions of Marian Scott, with their clean lines and meticulously balanced proportions, are, I believe, the closest approximation of painting and science." In her article, Marian Scott would add, "The chance to paint this mural coincided with a deep wish on my part for just such a chance. I, like so many painters of today, was feeling disturbed and inadequate in the isolation of the studio." Today, when we think about murals, our thoughts often go to outdoor murals, large-scale works of art painted on the sides of buildings that often honor prominent members of a community. A great example in downtown Montreal is the mural of Leonard Cohen. But for much of history, or really all of history, murals were works of art inside spaces, created to be permanent and often narrative. They told stories. Think about prehistoric cave paintings, the wall paintings that were found at Pompeii, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. By the early 20th century, murals had come to be seen as the highest, most prestigious type of art commission. Often massive, they were in important buildings, churches, banks, museums, hotels, headquarters of companies or government buildings like the Parliament of Canada, and the artists would usually be well compensated. Murals were also sometimes in private homes, too, but the big money and prestige was in murals for public spaces. The style and the subject of a mural, because of the cost, its permanence, and its visibility, were almost always a result of a collaboration between the patron and the artist. In the 1930s, mural painting had a particular renaissance. Through the Works Project Administration in the United States, many artists were hired to paint murals in public buildings, often post offices or schools. The artists selected were more often underemployed or unemployed artists who needed work to survive. Instead of allegorical figures or saints, these murals depicted American life, everyday farmers in their fields, workers building America, heroes like George Washington. Many were not necessarily great works of art. The program was to support artists and tell uplifting stories, brightening up some otherwise dull spaces. Artist Marian Scott, born in Montreal in 1906, is distinguished from many of her contemporaries by a willingness to keep experimenting and succeeding with a new style. For those of us who've studied her work, There's a never-ending delight in finding works that surprise us. A self-described autodidact, her curiosity knew no bounds. She read art books at the Blackadder Library at McGill, subscribed to art magazines, and visited exhibitions, traveling to New York, Ottawa, or Chicago when she could, and recording her thoughts in journals, in the exhibition catalogs she bought, or in letters to friends. Her interests were wide-ranging, not only art, but politics, as she and her husband were among the socialists in Montreal, promoting equality and workers' rights. Vienna-born Hans Selye studied medicine and chemistry in Prague, and then came to Johns Hopkins University, and from there to McGill in the 1930s. He studied endocrinology, the field of study involving advancing the understanding of glands and hormones. In layman's term, Selye's research looked at how stress in the body caused the endocrine system to react, and the physical response was often visible. Someone might be overweight, or very thin, or very tall, or very short, because of how their glands and hormones were responding. Selye would go on to be nominated for a Nobel Prize multiple times, although he never actually won. Dale Scott and Selye met through friends in the 1930s. She learned science. Selye would have learned about art and options for the mural. Dale Scott would have likely discussed earlier murals or mural-sized paintings depicting scientists or doctors. Enormous, larger-than-life portraits of heroic men in medicine, such as Philadelphia artist Thomas Aiken's The Agnew Clinic, commissioned to honor a famous doctor's retirement. It was all about ego. But if Selye had ever thought that his mural would be about him, he'd engaged the wrong artist. She also likely familiarized him with the controversy about Mexican artist Diego Rivera's Man at the Crossroads, created for Rockefeller Center in New York, and subsequently destroyed by Nelson Rockefeller, then head of the center, because the artist refused to remove a portrait of the Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin depicted in the mural. Crowded with symbols, workers, in a design that seemed to explode off the surface, it represented a new, more dynamic way to think about mural composition. As those of us in the field know, the best way to make an artwork famous is to destroy it. This is a reconstruction in Mexico City. There's another influence hinted at in the beginning of Selye's text. He began by writing, "Ever since its beginnings in the caves of France and Spain, 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, art has been used to give significance and direction to other human activities. To my eyes, this mural reminds me of the colors and the design of cave paintings in which the animals and figures float on the surface." What did Selye and Dale Scott know about them in the early 1940s? I found my answer. In 1937, an exhibition of the Frobenius collection was held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Consisting not of actual cave drawings, it included large-scale mural-sized watercolors of what was found in caves in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. They were a revelation to artists and to the public. In looking at the installation shots of the exhibition now, it seems clear to me that these were the type of images referenced by Selye in his text. For Dale Scott, who went to New York as often as she could to visit her friends and go to museums and galleries, this exhibition would have been exciting and inspirational. She must have seen it. Perhaps Selye did too. If we look again at endocrinology, here in this fabulous photograph by Brian Merritt, we see how Dale Scott made a modern mural about science with a seeker scientist and the subject of research, the glands, the hormones, and the people affected by them. They were all part of the picture. The best way to tell that story, our collaborators must have decided, was in a style that was as old as time, but just as new and fresh as ever.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Now, we welcome questions from the audience. If you want to put them in the chat, I will voice them on your behalf. But perhaps I'll kick off once again. with a question from me for Wendy, unless we have one from one of our other panelists. I yield the floor to you if you want it. But it's interesting, you've done a study of Marian Dale Scott's work, and I wonder if you could tell us in a little bit more specifics how you see this mural, this collaboration with Selye. How do you see the important differences between this and, as you said, her style changed quite a lot, but do you see that any trends or any significant differences in the style of this mural compared with her other work?
You fed me a great question, Jacqueline.
You're welcome.
Because after she did the mural, she spent basically the next 10 years doing works called, Atom and Bone. So she kept doing works that reference science. So it became very much part of her practice. Also, it changed her color palette. So those same sort of orange colors, the oranges and browns, are also very much a part of what she was doing for the next period in time. She really did learn all about endocrinology. Her archives at Library and Archives Canada are great because the books are, and then her book collection has also been preserved at the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Montreal. So I'm able to see that, yes, how serious she was, and then it comes through in the works of art she does for the next 10 years.
It's fascinating that the color palette as well has shifted. This particular mural, you mentioned in your presentation that murals traditionally were in buildings of importance and listed a few examples. And of course, the buildings we consider important change over time with cultural shifts. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the actual location where this one is situated. Tell me more about this room and why it was worthy of a mural, perhaps.
So it's basically a room that was a conference room in the Strathcona Medical Building. It's down an unassuming corridor. If we weren't in COVID times, I had been planning to film this in the room and walk everyone into the room so you could just see where this is and how to get there. The room became an office later for the head of the department. He's now moved next door, I think because I was annoying him so much by coming so often to look at this, and it's back to being used as a conference room. So that, and also McGill has used it as a background when they get grants now. So I'm always excited to see that in the background. And if you do go to this room, there's a little story about it that the Visual Arts Collection has put on the wall from research by one of our interns. So that you can't miss that what this is, that is something that's important. And I think one of the things for me that I think is very interesting about this, in contrast to murals across the city where you will see a person highlighted, the fact that it's the science that's highlighted makes it very different from the Leonard Cohen mural or the Daisy Peterson Sweeney mural. And also this question about permanence for murals. When they are outside on buildings, you have to repaint them all the time. When they're done in a building, they're there. The Leonardo's Last Supper has a few problems, but it's quite old. The cave paintings have survived quite well, but they have this sense that they're there for all time.
Yeah. So there's an admirable level of permanence to this one in that particular building at McGill. And you've in part answered a question that came in via the chat, comparing street art and street murals for their scientific content. Do you have an eye for this kind of thing? So you mentioned the Daisy Peterson Sweeney mural, and if I'm correct, that's down in Little Burgundy?
Yes,
near an outdoor park. So it's person focused, as you mentioned, and the example you showed was Leonard Cohen. Are there any that come to mind in Montreal that have a more conceptual focus, like this one on the science? Is there an example that comes to mind?
There's a new mural about COVID
Oh, really?
Yes,
Topical.
it's very decorative
appropriate.
and pretty, but it's sort of commemorating this moment. So yes, there are sometimes people do murals that are about things. The other thing about outdoor murals is they need to be palatable to everyone.
Mm.
The endocrinology mural, it really has confused people, a number of people over the years. And someone asked me a question recently about what did students think? And this is something I'm going to try to see if I can figure out. And a number of years ago, when they were doing renovations in the room and taking out of the asbestos, and after the meeting, somebody said, "Are we going to keep the mural?" And it was like, well, of course we keep the mural. The mural is important, but it isn't a work of art for everyone.
It's one that I know for my part has blossomed as I've been guided through it, through your presentation and through some of your colleagues as well. And Eric has attached, there's a mural with Conan Penfield at the center in the Neuro. So there's one you can go and have a look at someday when you're
We know all about that one.
Yeah, I imagine you do. For the public though,
it's by Mary Filer.
Yeah. There is another question that builds off of one I have, and we'll have to close with this one because we're running out of time here. But I was fascinated by the fact that these two people met through friends at the time. The question that comes in from the audience is, do we know more about the interactions between the two of them? Do we know how we felt about each other and how the relationship evolved?
We do know how they met. We know the person, and Brian Merritt, who's here, is a relative of the person, and they met at a party. They were sort of part of the same circle. Marian Dale Scott had done a portrait of someone named Patrick Rowlandson, a sort of abstract portrait, and reportedly the interest that Selye had was in having an abstract portrait, and she sort of talked him into having a mural. And the way, this has been great fun to talk about this idea that the conversations, the Friday afternoon scientists getting together, lead to amazing things. So yes, through friendship come many wonderful things, scientific advancements, and works of art.
Absolutely. On that note, I will now transition a little bit and say a number of thank yous to all of you presenters who spoke today. And I've lost my mouse. There it is. An enormous thank you to you all for your research, for sharing your thoughts and the insights into such fruitful and different friendships that have resulted in so many discoveries here at McGill and beyond, and also in publications. So if you want to read more, if these presentations have piqued your interest, we will send out links for further exploration in the collections. On screen here, you see our next conversation. If you want to join it again, we're going to have a less formal, a more informal conversation at our next meeting of the ROAAr Book Club, which is next week on January 26th. So we invite you to come back for that one. But I do have some thank yous. Nathalie mentioned at the beginning that our events are only possible because of the support of our sponsors and donors. So once again, a thank you to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and to private donors Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley. Also thanks to our library staff who are running support behind the scenes, Michelle McLeod and Labiba Faiza. Thank you for helping things run smoothly. And thank you enormously to our co-organizers, the Red Path Museum, and for the researchers, Laura, Ingrid, Eric, Chris, Wendy. Thank you for sharing the fruits of your research and opening our eyes to so many interesting stories and friendships that have borne fruit here at McGill. So thank you everyone for coming. We'll wrap up there, and we hope to see you again at one of our events this term. Thanks, everyone, and a big round of applause for your presentations. Good night.